Chancellor Naira Voidsong stared at the application hovering before her, its quantum particles shifting uneasily as if reflecting her own discomfort. In 3,000 years of leading the Celestial Institute of Advanced Sciences, she had never encountered anything quite like this. "You can't be serious about considering this organism," Professor Thelix said, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns of clear distress. "Their species hasn't even mastered psychic communication." And yet, Naira's voice resonated through the chamber, Raven Steele's test results are unprecedented. Look at her solution to the paradox maze. The holographic display shifted to show a complex mathematical problem that had stumped even the Institute's most brilliant minds. Where others had attempted to solve it using traditional 11-dimensional calculus, the human had somehow derived a solution using what she called practical engineering principles. "Crude, but effective," muttered Director Zinare, their plasma form pulsing with reluctant admiration. "Though I fail to see how a being of such dense matter could possibly integrate into our learning environments." The debate continued for hours, as was tradition in the Institute's circular chamber of deliberation. But Naira had already made her decision. There was something about this human's application that spoke to her, something that went beyond mere test scores and qualifications. The day Raven Steele arrived at the Institute's transportation hub, half the faculty gathered to witness the event. Their expectations of a dramatic entrance were thoroughly disappointed when a rather unremarkable human female simply walked through the quantum gate, carrying what appeared to be a primitive physical storage container. "Welcome to the Celestial Institute," Naira projected, adjusting her telepathic output to accommodate human sensory limitations. "I trust your quantum reassembly was satisfactory?" Raven smiled, a gesture that caused several energy-based beings to retreat slightly. "Thank you, Chancellor. The reassembly was fine, though I think I might have left my breakfast somewhere between Earth and here." "Fascinating," whispered Professor Thelix to a colleague. "It still requires chemical fuel processing." Raven's quarters had been specially modified to accommodate her biological needs, a concept that many faculty members found distastefully primitive. The room included what the Institute's xenobiologists assured her were reasonable approximations of human furniture, though the bed seemed to be floating 3 feet off the ground. "Your first class begins in what you would perceive as 2 hours, the orientation AI informed her. "Though I should note that time is rather more flexible here at the Institute." "About that," Raven said, pulling out a device from her bag that made several nearby sensors shriek in alarm. "I've been working on something to help me interface with your teaching methods." The device, as it turned out, was a hybrid of Earth technology and salvaged alien components, a crude but innovative attempt to bridge the gap between human neural patterns and the Institute's psychic educational interfaces. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't elegant, but like its creator, it would prove to be remarkably effective. As Raven settled into her quarters, Chancellor Naira observed through the Institute's quantum monitoring system. "And so it begins," she mused to herself, her form shifting through shades of deep space. "Either we have just admitted the most promising student in a millennium, or we have invited chaos itself into our halls of learning." The truth, as it would turn out, was somewhere in between. The human's presence would indeed bring chaos to the Institute's carefully ordered existence, but it would also bring something else, change. And in a universe that had grown perhaps too comfortable with its own perfection, change might be exactly what was needed. Raven spent her first night unable to sleep, tinkering with her neural interface device. Outside her window, the Institute's crystalline spires stretched up into a sky filled with 3 moons and countless stars. Somewhere out there, Earth seemed impossibly distant and small. But Raven wasn't here just for herself, she was here to prove that humanity belonged among the stars. Little did she know, she would end up proving far more than that. The first day of classes at the Celestial Institute proved more challenging than even Raven had anticipated. In quantum consciousness studies, Professor Lirith, a being composed purely of oscillating light waves, began the lesson by simply projecting complex 11-dimensional equations directly into the students' minds. Raven's jerry-rigged neural interface sparked and sputtered, translating the vast stream of psychic data into something her human brain could process. The results were less than ideal. "Miss Steele," Professor Lyritha's voice resonated with concern, "your consciousness appears to be fragmenting the unified field theory into linear components." "Sorry, Professor," Raven adjusted a dial on her device. "Still fine-tuning the translation matrices. Turns out converting pure thought into human-compatible neural patterns is trickier than I expected." Several of her classmates, most of them beings of pure energy or crystalline thought, watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as she physically manipulated the device. The concept of requiring tools to think was entirely alien to them. During advanced temporal mechanics, Raven's unique perspective caused an even greater stir. While her classmates naturally perceived time as a malleable medium, her human brain insisted on processing it linearly. This limitation, however, led to an unexpected breakthrough. "But Professor Nexus," she interrupted, causing the gaseous instructor to swirl in surprise, "if we consider time as a series of fixed points rather than a continuous flow, couldn't we bypass the paradox entirely?" The classroom fell silent. Professor Nexus, their form condensing with intense concentration, took several moments to process this suggestion. "Impossible," they finally declared. "Such a primitive approach could never." They paused, their gaseous form swirling rapidly as complex calculations played out. "By the cosmic core," they whispered, "it actually works." Word of the incident spread quickly through the Institute's psychic network. Chancellor Naira found herself fielding concerns from the Board of Ethereal Trustees about the disruption this human student was causing to established teaching methodologies. "She's forcing us to reconsider principles we've taken for granted for millennia," Professor Thelix complained during an emergency session. "It's causing distress among the more sensitive students." "Perhaps," Naira responded, her form shimmering with barely contained amusement, "that is precisely what we need." Meanwhile, Raven spent her evenings in her quarters, surrounded by scattered components and holographic diagrams. Her neural interface device, while functional, still wasn't performing as well as she needed it to. The headaches after each class were getting worse, and she knew she was missing at least half of what her professors were trying to teach. "There has to be a better way," she muttered, soldering another connection on her prototype. A soft chime announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Director Zinare. "Your struggles have not gone unnoticed," the plasma being stated, floating into the room. "While many of my colleagues view your presence here as problematic, I find your adaptability intriguing." Raven looked up from her work, trying to focus on the shifting form before her. "I'm not giving up, if that's what you're here about." "Quite the contrary," Zinare responded, their plasma form pulsing with what might have been amusement. "I'm here to offer assistance. Your neural interface concept is innovative, but perhaps we've been approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Instead of forcing our teaching methods to conform to human neural patterns, what if we could enhance your brain's natural capacity for multidimensional thinking?" The implications of this suggestion were staggering. "You're talking about modifying my actual neural architecture? Is that even possible?" "My dear," Zinare's form brightened, "at the Celestial Institute, the question is never whether something is possible, but rather why no one has attempted it before." As they began discussing the technical details, neither of them noticed Chancellor Naira observing from the quantum monitoring system, her form glowing with satisfaction. The human was already catalyzing exactly the kind of change she had hoped for, forcing the Institute to question its most fundamental assumptions about consciousness, learning, and the nature of intelligence itself. The next few weeks would prove whether Raven's human brain could adapt to these modifications, or whether some gaps between species were too fundamental to bridge. But one thing was becoming clear: the Institute would never be quite the same again. 3 months into her studies at the Celestial Institute, Raven's modified neural architecture was functioning better than anyone had expected. The searing headaches had subsided to a dull throb, and she could now perceive up to 7 dimensions simultaneously, not quite the 11 dimensions her classmates navigated effortlessly, but a remarkable improvement nonetheless. It was during an advanced practical session in quantum engineering that everything changed. Professor Vexuri had the class attempting to stabilize a miniature quantum singularity, a standard exercise that every third-year student was expected to master. Remember, Vexuri's crystalline form refracted light in teaching patterns. The key is to maintain perfect harmony between all dimensional frequencies. Raven noticed it first, a subtle discordant vibration in the quantum matrix. Her human brain, still processing part of reality in linear fashion despite its modifications, detected the pattern anomaly that her classmates' more advanced consciousness missed. "Professor," she called out, her neural interface flashing warning signals, "the harmonic resonance is cascading." Before Vexuri could respond, the containment field around the quantum singularity began to fluctuate. Students of various energy states backed away as alarms blared throughout the facility. "Impossible," Vexuri declared, their crystalline form vibrating with concern. "The safety protocols." The singularity pulsed, sending out waves of quantum displacement that began to tear at the fabric of local spacetime. Several students shifted into their higher dimensional forms to escape, while others froze in panic. Raven's mind raced. The standard emergency protocols weren't working. She could see the quantum feedback loop growing stronger with each attempt to contain it. But where her classmates saw only chaos in the failing containment field, her human pattern recognition spotted something else. "It's not random," she muttered, pulling up the facility's engineering schematics on her neural interface. "The singularity is resonating with the Institute's main power core." Without waiting for authorization, Raven sprinted to the engineering control panel. Her classmates watched in horror as she began physically manipulating the controls, a method considered dangerously primitive for quantum engineering. "Miss Steele, step away from the controls," Professor Vexuri ordered. "The containment protocols will fail," Raven interrupted, her fingers flying over the panel. "The singularity has synced with the power core's frequency. But if we introduce a deliberate phase variance..." She slammed her hand down on the emergency override, initiating a sequence that no properly educated quantum engineer would ever consider. The power core stuttered, cycling through a rapid series of dimensional frequencies. For one terrifying moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, with a sound like reality itself sighing in relief, the quantum singularity collapsed back in on itself, harmlessly dissipating into the containment field. The silence that followed was profound. Professor Vexuri's crystalline form had gone completely transparent, a sign of deep shock in their species. The other students slowly shifted back into their standard dimensional states, staring at Raven with new eyes. Chancellor Naira materialized in the laboratory moments later, accompanied by Director Zinare and several members of the Board of Ethereal Trustees. "Explain," Naira commanded, her form shifting through shades of intense curiosity. Raven took a deep breath, running her hand through her sweat-dampened hair, a very human gesture that made several trustees recoil slightly. The containment protocols were actually feeding the problem. They were too perfect, too harmonious. The singularity was using that harmony to amplify itself. Sometimes you need to introduce a little chaos to restore order. "Fascinating," Director Zinare pulsed thoughtfully. "Your human perspective allowed you to see a solution that our traditional methods would never have considered." "A dangerous solution," one of the trustees objected. "Using physical controls for quantum engineering? Deliberately disrupting dimensional harmony? These methods violate every principle we teach." And yet, Chancellor Naira's voice resonated with quiet authority, "they worked. Perhaps it's time we reconsidered some of our principles." As the debate began among the faculty, Raven quietly slipped away to her quarters. Her neural interface was giving her the worst headache she'd had in weeks, and she could feel a stress tremor starting in her hands. But beneath the physical discomfort, there was a growing sense of vindication. She had just proved that sometimes the most primitive solution could be the most effective. It was a lesson the Institute would not soon forget. In the weeks following the quantum incident, the atmosphere at the Celestial Institute underwent a subtle but profound transformation. Students began approaching their studies differently, asking questions that would have been unthinkable just months before. During an advanced dimensional theory class, a crystalline student named 9RA raised what would have previously been considered a heretical question: "Professor, could we attempt to solve this using the human method?" Professor Thelix, who had once been Raven's harshest critic, found himself pausing thoughtfully. "You mean by breaking down the multidimensional problem into linear components? Interesting. Perhaps we could explore both approaches." Word of these changes reached the highest levels of galactic academia. The Institute began receiving inquiries from other prestigious institutions about their human integration experiment. Some were scandalized, others intrigued, but none could ignore the results. Raven herself had become something of a reluctant celebrity. Students from all species would seek her out between classes, curious about her perspective on everything from quantum mechanics to consciousness itself. "But how do you manage with only one consciousness stream?" a gaseous student named Helith asked during a study session. "Don't you find it limiting?" Raven adjusted her neural interface, which she had continued to modify and improve. "Actually, I think it helps me focus. When you can only look at a problem from one angle at a time, you have to be really sure about what you're seeing." Director Zinare, who had been monitoring these interactions with growing interest, approached Chancellor Naira with an unprecedented proposal. "I believe we should establish a new research department," their plasma form pulsed with excitement. "We could call it Alternative Cognitive Approaches to Quantum Engineering." Naira's form shimmered with amusement. "You want to institutionalize chaos?" "I want to study how different forms of consciousness approach universal problems," Zinare corrected. "The human success suggests there might be value in perspectives we have traditionally dismissed as primitive." The proposal sparked heated debate among the faculty. Traditional professors argued that it would undermine millennia of established teaching methods. Progressive elements saw it as an opportunity to evolve beyond their current limitations. The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected development. Students had begun experimenting with Raven's hybrid approach to problem solving, combining traditional multidimensional thinking with linear analysis. The results were extraordinary. In the quantum engineering lab, a group of students successfully developed a new method for stabilizing wormholes using what they called controlled imperfection, deliberately introducing minor flaws to prevent catastrophic harmonic resonance. The xenobiology department reported breakthroughs in understanding primitive species and neural patterns, leading to improved methods of interspecies communication. Even the ancient art of psychic projection was being revolutionized by incorporating elements of human-style focused consciousness. "It appears," Professor Thelix admitted during a faculty meeting, his crystalline form glowing with reluctant admiration, "that we had become too perfect for our own good. The introduction of imperfection, of humanity, has allowed us to grow in unexpected ways." Raven, meanwhile, found herself struggling with success in a very human way. The constant attention and pressure to innovate were taking their toll. One evening, as she sat in her quarters attempting to meditate, a skill she'd learned from a gaseous classmate, Chancellor Naira, materialized. "You seem troubled," the Chancellor observed. "I came here to learn," Raven sighed. "Instead, I feel like I'm changing everything. Maybe too much, too fast." Change, Naira's form shifted through contemplative patterns, is neither good nor bad. It simply is. What matters is how we adapt to it. And you, Raven Steele, have taught us that adaptation doesn't always mean achieving greater perfection. Sometimes it means embracing our limitations and finding strength in them. As if to emphasize this point, Raven's neural interface chose that moment to spark slightly, causing her to wince. "Still not perfect," she muttered, adjusting it. "No," Naira agreed, her form brightening with what might have been a smile. And that's precisely what makes it remarkable. The day of the final trial arrived with a tension that seemed to vibrate through all 11 dimensions of the Institute's space. In its 1,000-year history, the graduation challenge had never been attempted by a human. Many doubted whether it was even possible for a partially linear consciousness to complete. The trial chamber was a vast sphere of pure quantum potential, its walls shifting between states of matter and energy. The entire faculty had gathered to witness the event, along with representatives from major galactic institutions. Even the Cosmic Council had sent an observer, there form a swirling mass of dark matter and curiosity. Remember, Director Zinare told Raven as she prepared her neural interface for the final time, no student is expected to complete all aspects of the trial. It is designed to find your breaking point. Raven nodded, double-checking her equipment. The modified neural interface she wore now was far more sophisticated than her original design, a hybrid of human ingenuity and advanced quantum technology. What's the record for longest attempt? 6 hours, Professor Thelix answered, his crystalline form unusually subdued. Though most candidates withdraw within the first 2. Chancellor Naira materialized in the center of the chamber, her form radiating formal authority. Raven Steel of Earth, are you prepared to undertake the final trial of the Celestial Institute? I am, Raven replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach, a very human reaction that made several faculty members shift uncomfortably. The trial began without warning. The chamber's reality collapsed into pure quantum flux, forcing each candidate to construct their own stable pocket of existence or be lost in the chaos. Most students achieve this through perfect harmonic resonance with the quantum field. Raven, in characteristic fashion, took a different approach. Instead of fighting the chaos, she worked with it, using the random fluctuations to create a dynamic equilibrium. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The challenges escalated rapidly. Temporal paradoxes required simultaneous solutions across multiple timelines. Dimensional puzzles demanded consciousness expansion beyond normal limits. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist, testing not just knowledge but the fundamental nature of thought and existence. Hour after hour passed. Raven's neural interface sparked and smoked, pushed to its limits. Sweat dripped down her face, a distinctly human sign of strain that fascinated the observers. Where other students typically withdrew when their consciousness began to fray, Raven's human stubbornness drove her forward. At the 7-hour mark, something unprecedented occurred. The trial chamber's quantum field began to resonate with Raven's unorthodox problem-solving patterns. Instead of forcing solutions through pure intellectual perfection, she was adapting the very nature of the challenges themselves. Impossible, whispered the Cosmic Council observer. She's rewriting the parameters of reality by introducing controlled entropy. The final challenge manifested as a quantum singularity similar to the one that had caused the infamous incident months ago. But this time, instead of containing it, the trial required the candidate to harmonize with it completely. Raven's neural interface was barely functioning now, circuits fused and crystals cracked. With trembling hands, she removed it entirely. What is she doing? Gasped Professor Thelix. Without the interface, her consciousness will be overwhelmed. But Raven had learned something during her time at the Institute that went beyond technology and quantum theory. She had learned that the greatest barrier between human and advanced consciousness wasn't physical, it was conceptual. With her neural interface disabled, she faced the singularity with only her human consciousness. And instead of trying to master it through perfect harmony like her predecessors, she embraced the chaos within it, within herself, within reality itself. The singularity responded, not with destruction, but with transformation. The quantum field of the entire chamber shifted, finding a new kind of balance, not the perfect stability of traditional solutions, but a dynamic, evolving equilibrium that drew strength from its own imperfections. When it was over, Raven stood in the center of the chamber, exhausted but upright. She had not just survived the trial, she had redefined it. Chancellor Naira materialized beside her, her form radiating with an emotion that transcended normal psychic wavelengths. In all our history, she announced to the stunned audience, we have sought to achieve perfection through the elimination of chaos. Today, we have learned that true mastery comes not from denying chaos, but from understanding it. Raven Steel, you have done more than pass the final trial. You have taught us all a new way to perceive reality itself. As the chamber erupted in a display of multidimensional appreciation, Director Zinare turned to the Cosmic Council observer. Now you understand why we must both fear and respect humans. They don't just solve problems, they change the very nature of what's possible. The observer's dark matter form swirled thoughtfully. Perhaps, they mused, it's time for the galaxy to change too.